the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, Alien Nations, Alien Nation, and Allies in Asia, Tales of the Imperium, and the Science and Magic, plus part 20 of our complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Hard Magic. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen editor Tony Daniel. We talked with Charles E. Gannon this time about his new book, Trial by Fire. Trial by Fire is the sequel to Chuck's Nebula-nominated, Compton Crook Award-winning novel Fire with Fire, and it's book 2 in his Tales of the Terran Republic series. It's space opera and adventure science fiction on a grand scale, and Chuck will tell us all about it. And, of course, we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Hard Magic, as read by Bronson Pinchot. But first, here's the news. There's new free fiction and free nonfiction at the Baen.com front page. For those who don't know, and as a reminder for those who do, every month on the 15th, we update the main page with a new story by a favorite Baen author and an engaging nonfiction piece. This time we have a story by Jody Lynn Nye called An Imperial Pursuit. This is set in the world of her upcoming novel Fortunes of the Imperium, which is her really fun Jeeves in Space series set in a far future star empire. Also new is Dr. Ted Roberts' great look at the science of magic within fantasy, or at least the logic of science within fantasy, in his article, Even Fantasy Needs a Little Science, Even Magic Needs Rules. Dr. Ted is a neurobiologist, and he's both a huge fan of fantasy and a scientist who likes to examine the system behind the magic in such tales, with an eye to the logic that makes the magic seem magical, and not to debunking it or anything. It's another great fun read. So check out An Imperial Pursuit. And Even Fantasy Needs a Little Science. Even Magic Needs Rules. You can find them at the Baen.com website now. And if you're listening to this later in time, you can still find these articles and short stories in our ebook collections. They are absolutely free and available at BaenEbooks.com. Go there and put in the term free short stories in the search pane, and all of those collections for the various years will pop up for you to acquire. And for the nonfiction, put in free nonfiction, and the same thing will happen. Talk about science so advanced that it's indistinguishable from magic. So happy reading. I want to welcome Charles E. Gannon to the podcast. Hi, Chuck.
Hello. How you doing, Tony?
Chuck Gannon is the author of Nebula-nominated, Compton Crook-winning science fiction novel, Fire with Fire. Chuck is also the co-author with Eric Flint of Ring of Fire novels 1635, Papal Stakes, and 1636, Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. He is also co-author with Steve White of Starfire series entry Extremis, and an upcoming entry. What's that one going to be called?
That one is called Imperatives.
Imperatives. He's also the author of many short stories, including some in David Weber's World of Honor anthologies. Chuck's latest novel is the sequel to Fire with Fire. That book is Trial by Fire, and it is now at booksellers everywhere. Chuck, at the end of Fire with Fire, Kane Reardon has informed Earth that not only was there extraterrestrial life out there, but that it considered itself worthy to sit in judgment of humanity. Can you give us a picture of the interstellar political situation at the start of Trial by Fire? What are the Accords, for instance?
Well, I'll actually try to do that in reverse. The Accords, basically, when the 10-person delegation that goes to meet the Accord, as it's called, learns what it is as a governing body, they really discover that it's a number of races in essentially a mutual non-aggression pact. It's not an alliance. It's not an effective government at all. And the political situation is that at the end, when we've learned at the end of Fire with Fire, that what was expected to be a sort of pro forma rubber stamp, you're part of the club now, turns out for humanity to be anything but. It turns out that there are already axes being ground in the Accord between, if you will, an older, dominant, fairly benign, but also somewhat moribund power, and some powers that are more aggressive, and we don't know why exactly. They all seem to have different axes that they're grinding, but they use Earth's candidacy as a kind of casus belli to stimulate that sort of contention, bring it out, and what should have been pro forma turns out to be a sort of a situation where, in fact, the Accord is virtually stymied, and no one really knows what's going to happen next. It is presumed that eventually there will be a convocation of this group called again, and things will be ironed out. But as we learned in Trial by Fire, that is not at all what's going to happen. And clearly, some of the powers went to the last convocation with the full intention that this was a prelude to something other than further talk.
What are the species that are in the Accords that we meet, that we have met?
Well, you have one species which serves as, but is not the same, which serves as what are called the custodian of the Accords. They're essentially your sort of peacekeeper, not lawgivers, but they make sure that the Accords are obeyed to the extent that they can. They're called the Dornani, but the custodians of the Accord are kind of unusually active Dornani. I guess you could say they still retain some of the energy and vigor that was once part of that species. Most of it seems to be a great deal more moribund and less prone to action and more prone to avoid conflict or significant involvement of any kind, and we don't exactly know why that is. That's one of the I guess you could say, soft-souled mysteries out there that will be addressed little by little as time and the series goes on.
Well, I don't want to give too much away, but it reminded me of a very contentious law firm, sort of different partners and junior partners.
Yeah, but of that old blue blood variety, which actually never appears in court. Everything is papers being shuffled back and forth. No one can agree on anything. No one can agree on what the interpretation was, and above all, don't do anything. So for anybody out there who's ever read Melville's Bartleby, the script, you might get a sense of the nature of the morbidity or the moribund aspect of what seemed to be coming out of the Dornani sphere, although we've not really seen into that sphere yet. As a matter of fact, only at the very end of the book do we hear the Dornani speak amongst themselves at the end of Trial by Fire. The next oldest of the exosapient races are called the Kator. I don't want to say too much about them for reasons you know, Tony. Probably that would be a larger than anybody who's listening to this who hasn't read the book yet would perhaps find it a bit of an excessive spoiler. Suffice it to say, though, that they seem to be pretty aggressive, pretty acquisitive, and have set themselves up in direct, if calm, opposition, at least on the surface, to the Dornani de facto leadership and seniority inside the Accord. After them, you have two other races which have been members for some indeterminate time. One are called the Slasriki. We know very little about them. Even at the end of the second book, Trial by Fire, we still know very little about them. We learn a lot more about another race called the Arat-Kur, and I know we'll probably chat a little bit more about them in the course of this conversation, who while their antagonism towards human entry into the Accord in Fire with Fire is a little bit mysterious, we get some clues as to why that might be, why they might feel that way in Trial by Fire. It seems, in fact, that humanity is not an unknown quantity, and perhaps earlier representatives of it from elsewhere had been perhaps moved off Earth and figure prominently in a sort of destruction or destroyer myth of the Arat Kur. So they have a huge concern with us because they have tentatively identified us, that they believe, as that species, that destroyer species. And then you have one last race along with us that were both essentially entering or called to the convocation at the same time, and that group is called the Khakhluk. They are I guess the best way to describe them would be sort of a mixture of a variety of features. I know I'm not going to get into the physical description. We can do that later. But they are an overtly aggressive species. They are clearly descended from predator stock and have a variety of other kind of, I guess, from a human perspective, backwards or regressive traits in terms of social development and things of that nature. So those are the players.
Well, let's talk about our human hero for a bit. You call Cain Reardon a polymath, and he really is a jack-of-all-trades kind of guy. But he's very believable. He's not quite Doc Savage, which is a little fanciful, and he makes a great hero. What can you tell us about Cain?
Well, when I set out to create Cain and write him, I really only wanted to give him one really notable quality. One really notable, they say every hero has to have a superpower, right? That's what makes them stand out. That's their tag. Whether, obviously it's not a superpower in a hard science fiction novel, but that expression, that notion that there's at least one thing they do really well. And it is not, in his case, that he is not a trained soldier. He is not a trained operative. He is not a mechanical whiz. He's none of those things. What he is a polymath. He is that sort of individual who can look at problems and unfamiliar situations and so much of what is already in his mind. Basically, this is the sort of individual who, if they experience something and they acquire knowledge, almost all of it is ready at their fingertips. It's kind of, we have this notion of eidetic memory, of photographic memory. Imagine for a second if you had something akin to that, but instead of remembering precise words or precise phrases or precise pictures, you remember concepts. And your ability to play with concepts, almost like a deck of cards, all of them always available and evident to you, is really what his skill is. And that is what, in many ways, a polymath is, in fact, that they're able to cross-pollinate different areas of knowledge and insights and experiences to solve problems quickly and across boundaries that perhaps other people would not be able to jump. And that's, so to speak, his superpower. And it gets him into some trouble sometimes, and it gets him out of trouble sometimes.
Yeah, and he's a very likable character, even though he sees outside the box. He's very sympathetic to all that are around him.
Well, one of the things that I've tried to he winds up being his role in these first two books, and I think it's probably not surprising for any reader, or even it wouldn't be a spoiler to say that in large measure a role that will continue for him is that he's become a de facto sort of first contact specialist. Not because he's a first contact specialist, because there is no, there was no way to train in advance for that. His primary claim to fame is, well, you've done it and you didn't mess up. So go and do it again. And he tends to be in depending on how you look at it, in just the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, as the case may be, to frequently be in this situation where he is initiating first contacts with other species. However, partly his skill at that is connected to his polymathic traits. And what I mean by that is his ability to sort of take a look at features that are present in another species and the way they communicate, and figures of speech and biological traits and physiology. He begins to get sort of a story and appreciation of where they're coming from and what might be motivating them a shade faster than other humans. And that's his claim to fame, I guess you could say. So he is, I guess you could, to go along with what you're saying, in one sense, he's naturally sympathetic to others because he has that reflex that tells him the only way I'm going to understand another entity, whether it's one of my own species or a different species, is try to learn how to walk in their shoes, what it's like to see from where they sit, as the Korean expression has it. And he applies his polymathic abilities, hardly perfectly, but with some positive effect to that task.
Yeah, and one of his main task in Trial by Fire is applying that to the Eric Kerr, who are a rather gruesome-looking species, but they are our antagonists for the most part, or at least they seem to be. But despite their intent to subjugate Earth, they're not wholly belligerent. In fact, Kane has this counterpart among them who's really a wonderful and thoughtful and winning character. I liked him a lot. This is Darcy Cutt. Tell us how he views our species.
Well, now I can tell you a little bit, but I can't tell you everything because of spoilers.
Oh, sure.
Darcy Cutt, however, does see our species perhaps differently than the leadership caste of the Arat Corps. He is sort of the next caste down, and he sees us as well, I guess you could say that the party line amongst the Arat Corps, because the Arat Corps are not really at all warlike, which is one of the things that I think very much comes to the fore as the novel goes on. They have considerable technological superiority, but they do not practice war, and they haven't fought one for a very, very long time. And so there's this party line amongst the leadership caste of the Arat Corps that humans are steeped in warfare, steeped in their own blood. Their first reflex is violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is, to use a term that wouldn't normally apply to alien species, they engage in classic dehumanization of the foe before they go off to war. Well, Darcy Cutt is somebody who is not buying the party line. He sees other things. He sees a species that also strives to do better, to cure ills, whether they might be social or physical, that very often has taken up arms sometimes in the attempt to stop great cruelty, and of course there we get into that fighting fire with fire that gives the title of the first book. And he sees us as a much more complicated mixed species than his superiors are passing off, and largely successfully, to the rest of the Arat Corps. This, by the way, doesn't make him any more popular with his superiors, and sometimes Ken Riordan has been with his own superiors, because you buck the party line at your own peril. And these two characters have that in common, and to some degree, it's a bond between them.
Well, I love the way that the Arat Corps can go catatonic due to agoraphobia. That's so wonderful. How did they evolve? What are the Arat Corps? How did they become an intelligent species? I'm just curious about that.
And that's a wonderful question for me, because it's like slow pitch, softball with a watermelon. I'm really looking forward to hitting this one, because this gets to some of why I really enjoy writing hard science fiction. In that my definition of the Arat Corps and the problems of the Arat Corps and the challenges of the Arat Corps really come right up out of their evolution. They are, not only do they look, as you said, they're kind of gruesome looking, at least to us. They think we're terrible looking also, by the way. They consider the fact that our face is so plastic and it changes in such expression to be, they almost see us as blob-like, which is distressing to them. They, on the other hand, just to give listeners who might not be familiar, imagine mostly a homeothermic, so largely mammalian, cross between a horseshoe crab and a cockroach of maybe about 4 to 5 feet in length. So not prepossessing to our eyes. Their origin is subterranean. And one of the reasons they have and the reason they are subterranean is because they were trappers. They are not predators. They are omnivorous, but obviously a build like that is not going to be built for speed, certainly not for long endurance. It is very much optimized for tunnels, narrow passages, things like that. Their rise to intelligence essentially is the equivalent of, if you can remember I think this is a trope that everybody will probably recall in the beginning of 2001, A Space Odyssey, when the proto-human called, I think, Moonwatcher, throws the bone up in the air. He's invented the first weapon, and with it he's fought successfully for a waterhole, was driven off a rival tribe, and killed animals for meat, and his tribe was just about out of existence, and now they had this turnaround, and this becomes, it's sort of the catalyst for thinking. It's the catalyst for tool use. In the case of the Arat-Kur are burrowers, and something falls in their pit, and then one day, one of them, we don't know who, or several of them in different places, realize that, well, what if we put something, because they notice that others come to the pit to try to get the dead creature out. So they if you will, they evolved the notion of bait. And then they evolved the notion of, well, once they fall in, it would really be helpful if they were really badly hurt. And then they noticed that if they fall on rocks or sharp sticks or things like that, well, they not only fall in, getting to the bait, but then they impale themselves or knock themselves silly. And ultimately, they go through this slow process of evolving tool use that is only in the broadest of senses is like human tool use. They're not free-ranging creatures. They're not creatures of the trees. They're not creatures of the plains. They do not have a background in the seas. But yet, it's that I felt it very important to define the fulcrum moment when they go from being, if you will, a creature of natural attributes to a creature that is relying increasingly and in an accelerating fashion upon tool use. And so that's where they come from. And the agoraphobia, I guess, is therefore kind of, when you hear all that, is kind of obvious, because they become increasingly comfortable underground. They are the masters of the subterranean, but they're very, very vulnerable when they go topside. If you think for a second of a cockroach and a horseshoe crab, they don't have a neck. They can't turn around and see what's behind them. And the sensory organs that you would evolve to operate well in a subterranean environment, which would probably be vision in the infrared range and really ability to discriminate very, very subtly on an audio level, are not going to be particularly useful. As a matter of fact, you might consider the surface world to be just an incredibly noisy, chaotic, blinding, and deafening environment. So when they get into a large space, a large, well-lit space, particularly when they can see the walls and there's the ceiling is far, far above them, they get a little bit freaked out.
Trial by Fire is great adventurous space opera too. Let's talk about spaceship battles. There are some tremendous spaceship battles in the book, and you have different ships with different capabilities. How do the Earth ships and the Arat-Kur ships match up?
Well, because I took so much time talking about the species, I'll keep this one very, very to the point. No Jane's entries here on the respective merits of their ships. I will say this much: the Arat-Kur ships are far more advanced than ours. They do very elegantly what we do very crudely. You don't have huge capability differences in the sense that they can go so many more times our speed, or they can do things or use weapons that are beyond our comprehension. We understand what they do pretty well from fairly early sensor results, but they do it with much smaller hulls, much greater economy, much less possibility of failure and breakdown. They tend to be a conservative species, as one might expect subterranean trappers to be. They tend not to advance as quickly, perhaps, as humans. They're very slow. They're very methodical, and therefore they have honed to an art form. We're very, very new on the interstellar scene. As the when the war commences, that's in this book, humanity has only been capable of interstellar travel for about 15 years. And let's just say the Arachur have had it a lot longer than that. But one of the things about the human craft, going back to the earlier components of our discussion, the very few of the Arachur craft are built specifically for war. They don't think in terms of war. And so they have a lot of ships that are extremely modular, that are carrying modules that are war oriented. Whereas the human craft, however comparatively primitive or crude they might be, most of those are designed for exactly the job they are being sent to do. So you've got it's a kind of one of the things I had fun with, and hopefully readers will have fun with, is that although it's not asymmetrical combat in the sense of guerrillas versus conventional armies, each area has its own specializations which do not match up. It's not like, for instance, the British versus the German navies in World War I, where there are differences, but the doctrine is largely the same, the craft are largely the same, and the areas of specialization are, again, largely the same. Not here. There are very considerable differences.
Well, you bring a Weberian, as in David Weber, detail to some of these battles, and they're really great to follow. How does the FTL work, the faster-than-light technology, and how does it affect the military situation?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into the physics of how it works. Although I did a friend of mine, I'm a member of Sigma, which is, quote, science fiction in the national interest, and people can look it up online, and a bunch of science fiction writers, and we work pro bono for folks mostly in the defense and intelligence community, and largely in the Beltway. And the reason that I bring that up is because one of the members of Sigma is a fellow by the name, and he publishes with Tor, Ian Tregillis. Now, Ian Tregillis works at, I think it's Livermore Labs, and is one of the really sort of highly placed people in the inertial fusion project. So when I designed the FTL drive, I sent it to him, and he was kind enough to vet as much as we can guess about it. In other words, were my theories consistent? And so I went further afield, and I got some expert advice, so to speak, as much as you can get expert advice on these things. In how does it affect the military situation here? Essentially, ships do not spend time in anything like hyperspace. It's a field effect, and it is most similar to, but is not exactly, quantum entanglement. As one character says, his name is Lemuel Wasserman, whose uncle was essentially as much as you can say any one individual invented this drive, did, that the potentiality of the ship is transmitted from one place, or is imparted from one place to another, based on the same sort of thing that when you have a quantum entanglement situation where one particle goes away from one place and shows up someplace else. Is it the same particle? Maybe but in all probability, it's either the same particle which somehow magically teleported, or as I think is the standing models, the standard model's primary interpretation is that its potentiality has been broken down in one place and recreated someplace else. So the important thing here is that you come from you are in one system, you gather energy, you make what's called the shift, and you are instantaneously in wherever you are going to. You can't, there are limitations on range. The earlier the technology, the shorter the range. Also for humans, when they get to the far side, they are dead in space, no matter how fast they were going before, because all of the energy, including the kinetic energy, is useful and used in the process of initiating the shift. Some of the more advanced, we know from one scene at the end of Fire with Fire that the Gornani have most of just to go back to remind folks a second, they are the most advanced, the oldest of the members of the Accord. When they come out of shift space, they still have velocity, and they can travel much further than humans and with much greater precision. And even the entire effect of transition has some of the humans wondering, did they just do this the way we did it, or did they find a different way to do it? So we have this sense that there are not only different levels of expertise within the same sort of technology to achieve an effect, there may be whole other ways of achieving it when you get more advanced. So obviously from a military standpoint, communication travels at the speed of ships. So we're back in that regard to the sailing ship era, pre-telegraph. And it also means that when you come in to some degree, you're weak. You don't want to come in right on top of a waiting fleet because they may have speed and they may have things that you, at least the humans, are going to have to rebuild to move to engagement. So it's a tricky little chess game.
Well, another piece of technology that a lot of the action in the book revolves around, a technological MacGuffin, is the mass driver in Indonesia. What is a mass driver? Why is it strategically important?
Well, mass drivers go all the way back to the 1970s. I mean, as a notion of something that would have considerable importance. Mass drivers, as originally conceived for the moon here by Joel K. O'Neill, I think it was called "Settling the Space Frontier." I want to say was essentially a mass driver is a set of it's like the railguns that we're seeing now are being tested on naval vessels and in a variety of other ways, where you have just a bunch of repelling magnets that will send an object that interacts with them magnetically. Each one of them bumps it, so to speak, further down a tube or a line, and each bump adds speed onto it to phenomenal speeds. In the case of why is it strategically important in Indonesia, for the same reason they wanted to use it on the moon. They wanted to the idea was to build components of the space station, particularly shielding and other things, and cargo and et cetera, by essentially putting it in capsules, which are essentially delivery capsules that are accelerated by the mass driver and sent to where you want them. Now, for folks who are familiar with today's realities, and probably almost always the realities of lifting anything from a planet to low Earth orbit or beyond, you have that issue of launch costs. Launch costs are extremely expensive, and the thing about a mass driver is whether or not it can put it in orbit is I don't want to say it's almost besides the point, but when you think that a mass driver can be driven by a power plant delivering its megawatt levels of power to, let's say, put this thing up independently to 60 or 90,000 feet, and then its own fairly small rocket kicks in and takes it the rest of the way. This would reduce launch costs phenomenally. The complexity of the system, the cost of the system that would be delivering this cargo would be extremely, extremely simple compared to current vertical or even, whether it's runway to runway, i.e. horizontal lift or vertical lift spacecraft of the modern age. And whatever your technology is, if you get, so to speak, a free ride, a good chunk of the way and perhaps all the way to low Earth orbit, that's, you're paying now electricity costs. You're paying the grid rather than building a purpose-built, vehicle that has that's carrying the fuel and the power plants and all that, and that really simplifies things and reduces costs. So it is of immense importance in terms of getting anything that's planetide in at the bottom of the gravity well out. And when you deprive a planet of that sort of ability, if it's been depending upon that ability, it impacts everything. It not only impacts your ability to spread in space. Once you have a booming space industry, now you have a problem. All your earthly markets, to the extent that they have now become dependent upon being able to ship things off world, they are dealing with vastly increased costs, and that's going to have knockdown effects all the way, to the smallest economic level.
Why is it in Indonesia? Is it political or a scientific reason?
Well, it's as we learn in the course of the book, it was shall we say cannily built, because it was built with the anticipation that it would become a really useful target. If there was anybody out there who might be looking to target it, they might want to get their hands on it because they understand implicitly all these values. It's on Indonesia for a couple of reasons. First of all, Indonesia is a great launch site. It's pretty much right on the equator, which you want. It's mountainous at certain points, not like the Andes, but you wouldn't want the Andes. But it gives you some nice features, volcanic cones, to build a sort of gentle accelerating slope. And Indonesia is known in the if you will, the future history that I'm working with as being a very it's not finding its place, what it considers to be its rightful and deserved place amongst the community of nations. And there's a lot of dissent and dissatisfaction there, particularly at some fairly high power broker levels, which is, of course, going to be tempting to anybody who would like to suborn any aspect of earthly power centers to help them, not invade, but to redress wrongs.
Earth this is not just humans versus aliens. Earth has got various political factions, as we do now. And one of the factions has allied itself with the aliens, which is Codevco, sort of an amalgamation of mega corporations. So how did they get a military force?
There's actually, it's a question with several different parts to an answer. In the first place, they managed to put in place a puppet government in Indonesia. As I'm sure folks are aware, Indonesia is an extremely populous nation. It has, at least in terms of raw numbers, a not inconsiderable military force. Not a very sophisticated force. On the other hand, they also have made a sort of sweet deal with Codevco. Codevco is breaking laws regarding human cloning, which is sort of is known and suspected probably just a little bit more than the outer world knew what Germany was doing in terms of the concentration camps prior to 1942, 41. And a lot of people just don't want to know. And the subdivision of Codevco called Optogene is essentially creating soldiers, is growing them up, so to speak, for that one purpose. So that's where their ground forces come from, and their ground forces are not used very aggressively. The whole purpose, really, when you get right down to it, is it creates a fig leaf of legitimation for the invaders. The invaders are not coming down to invade; they're coming down to support Indonesia's essentially embrace of Codevco as a partner in all sorts of enterprises, including cloning, including use of the mass driver and completion of the mass driver, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Codevco brings something else to the table, which is there are 5 blocks into which the earthly nations are overwhelmingly allied. And Codevco wanted representation in that as a 6th block. It did not get it. It is not happy with it. And the one thing that it has that only the blocks possess are interstellar capable craft. And the moment you have an interstellar capable craft, people have to take you seriously. There's a lot you can do with that, and there's a lot of places you can go and a lot of trouble you can make. So it is very much, they don't have decisive military forces, but they have military forces that are significant enough that they could not be wiped out without considerable effort, and the wiping out of them creates a political problem where Codevco and the legitimate, apparently, Indonesian government can reach for off-world help to people not from our solar system to protect their rights, and that is in fact the legal fig leaf that is orchestrated.
Those slimy traitors.
Pardon me?
Those slimy traitors.
Well, that's, I have to say, having spent a little time, I've been on Wall Street for some interesting moments, and I have seen profit motivate behavior that is just amazing. That's all I'm going to say. And I'm not saying that nations are wonderful and beautiful and never make mistakes and can always be trusted or anything vaguely like that. But the greed is good philosophy when taken to an extreme in its own, I guess you could say, cultural fishbowl, can have people do things. I think it is not at all unreasonable to think that somebody would think, so to speak, outside their pack, if it meant if that was the better way to preserve one's interests and freedom, and I guess the way they would put it is freedom of market and influence. But yeah, that's I certainly don't write them to be terribly likable individuals, although they think they're doing things for, if people understand. I'm sure everybody knows somebody such as we see in the higher positions at Codevco. I'm sure every reader will say, I know that guy or that gal.
Well, we do have some great women characters in the book as well, both villains in Codevco and some heroines. For instance, Opal, Kane's maybe love interest, maybe not. She's a real effective warrior. What's her background?
Well, her background is Army, and with training in a number of interesting areas. She actually is the oldest living sleeper. What that means, very briefly, is one of the technologies which comes up out of medical technology and is then matured in the latter part of this century, the much latter part, is cryogenic. It's called sleep. And it is not cryogenic in the sense of actually frozen. That's the whole point. It's a mixture of things that you put in fluids such that the freezing point of blood is no longer that of water. It's actually somewhat lower than that. And you don't let anything freeze. You allow there to be some life function if possible, or in some cases, not. But you're always avoiding crystallization. And the bottom line is she was one of the first ones who, for medical reasons, was put into cryogenic stasis because they were not able to take care of her in the field the way she was wounded. So she wakes up. She's 60 years out of her time, and she comes into the world knowing no one. Her very youngest relatives at the time are pretty. They're elderly and they don't know her. She's been considered dead for 2 or 3 generations, and she's originally brought on as a bodyguard for King Riordan without him even knowing it. And so she is extremely capable. She's really used to being a pretty tough, pretty self-reliant sort of commander, and she does so. One of the things that I sometimes wonder if I suspect Baen readers will pick up on this, but I'm not sure that always external reviewers do, is that the fact that she really doesn't have any family really shapes the sort of rapid emotional affiliations she makes, because she is a person who has essentially, if you will, she's taken a one-way trip forward into time, more than half a century, and that's not minor. And human beings will perhaps act in certain ways and make relationships with certain speeds in that sort of scenario that they wouldn't if they just woke up after, let's say, being in a coma for a month. And that's a really important, I would say, footnote to always bear in mind when looking at that character and what she does and why and when.
Yeah, that's a great theme that travels that flows through a lot of really good science fiction as well. That sort of waking up and the world has changed completely, but you're still you character. Think about the Forever War, books like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So there are science fiction writers who take humanity like as a pestilence. We see a lot of those at other publishing houses, but you have a more hopeful tack. You even have Darcy Coote say of us, they are innovative. They can change their ideas very rapidly when pursuing a goal if they must. Do you really think there's a chance humans are something special in the galaxy, or did you just write them that way for the book? And if you do, why might that be?
Well, sample size of 1. I have no idea regarding the galaxy. I will say that one of the things that motivated me to write this entire series, as a matter of fact. And I can only speak so much to this before I get into spoiler zones again. But without treading carefully to stay away from those, I find it compelling that human beings are able to engage in, and this is what we were talking earlier about how Darje Cook sees us versus his leader test, that we can be capable of such sustained savage conflict, and yet we manage to move forward. We've had some big fallbacks and big diebacks. The fall of the Roman Empire, while perhaps over-advertised as it's the Dark Ages, yes, but it's the Dark Ages for a part of the world. It's just the part that Western literature and history tends to focus on, and we're left with this sense that the whole world plunges into darkness. No, the whole Western world, the Western world plunges into darkness. That's not the case around the Mediterranean and down towards Byzantium, etc. Whether we're special or not, well, I think that any species which can can walk that line between destruction, self-destruction, if you will, and yet creativity and the ability to grow and the ability to learn. I think any species which comes to intelligence through conflict rather than by diminishing conflict can at least claim that it has followed a far more arduous path. For instance, if we were to run into insect intelligences, hive minds out there, and whether one believes in these or not, let's just use that because it's a common trope. I mean, my gosh, that's one of science fiction's oldest tropes, I guess. One of the things that you get to about that pretty quickly is that there's something inherently additive about that. There may have been hives that, if you will, were in conflict with each other over resources, but there's almost a suggestion there that all the messy bits of pluralism and individual thought and desire and contending interests and all of that is largely eliminated. We have these sort of monoliths of control contending with each other, and apparently by the time they get into spaces, they're usually represented. They are indeed monolithic. They are the hegemon of their entire species, not merely by political striving, but by physiology and whatever their genetics are by that point. For humanity to do it, given how contentious we are, I think that's a pretty incredible achievement. So maybe I'm partial to my own origins, but that's one of the reasons that I tend to be, I guess you'd say, optimistic. Ultimately, I think it's for instance significant that because I'm a child of the '60s, and I remember hearing those air raid sirens, and you never knew right away whether they were drills or not. And where I lived, the question was, it's either a drill or it's not. And if it's not, it's 11 minutes if that's coming in from a sub, or 32 minutes that's coming in, that ICBM is coming in from the poles. And that we managed to, by hook, by crook, by luck, but also there were mistakes. We got lucky when it came to mistakes. But in general, it was overwhelmingly prudence, the ability to design those weapons, to play what was a very unwise game, the entire Cold War brinksmanship. But the fact of the matter is, even having been foolish enough perhaps to enter into that game as a species, we nonetheless found a way to get out. We got lucky a couple of times, but I'm not saying that there's no threat anymore, but we've passed what I would call the moment of easiest Armageddon. And that, I think, is something for which we should be duly proud of ourselves. And I think it's actually, I look at that as the sort of thing where you say, you look across, quote, the lines of the Cold War, and I always thought to myself, whatever else you can say about the folks across that line, they are part of this scenario that is somehow maintaining equilibrium. I'm not sure that what's going on in various parts of the Middle East right now can say that. But certainly the superpower states of that era have that in common. No one lost their head, because if anybody had, we would probably not be here to talk about it. And that's also where Fire with Fire comes from, in the sense that this trait, let's say that whether or not we're something special in the galaxy, that ability to maximize aggression at the same time that you are minimizing loss and maximizing recovery, so that almost every aggressive experience becomes a new platform upon which you build even more. That, I suspect, would be pretty rare, simply because it's hard to imagine us taking that to a further degree than we are. We've come right to that ragged edge, and I wonder if that wouldn't be an attribute that certain species that would find desirable.
The book is Trial by Fire by human partisan Charles E. Gannon. It's the rip-roaring, complex, and fun sequel to Nebula-nominated and Compton Crook Award-winning Fire with Fire, and it's now at booksellers everywhere. Chuck, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Tony, as always, a great fun being here. Great fun engaging in a conversation with, if by remote, with so much of the Baen readership, and I always look forward to meeting more of them in person whenever I get the chance. So anybody out there, you see me at a con, please come up to me, say hi. I love meeting you guys.
And now, here's part 20 of our complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Hard Magic, as read by Bronson Pinchot. This portion of Hard Magic is provided by Audible.com. Get the complete audiobook at Audible.com now. If you're not a subscriber, you can get the entire audiobook free or choose from more than 100,000 other titles when you try Audible free for 30 days. Here's what has gone before. It's the 1930s in America, but it's an America that has been magically changed. In the 1860s, a handful of people from all walks of life were visited with special magical talents, and each generation more are affected. These people are called actives. Most actives use their power for good, but some don't. Jake Sullivan is a private eye. He's also a former soldier, an ex-con, and an active heavy, the type of active that controls the force of gravity. Jake's good at that, and he's good at pounding things in general. Another active is young Faye, who is an active traveler. She's been on the run from magic-wielding goons who have killed her grandfather, and they want to do the same to Faye. Now, rescued by a strange group of actives, she, like Jake Sullivan, is being recruited by a mysterious secret society dedicated to seeing humanity through a possible magical-based apocalypse. These are known as the Grimnoir Knights. If the Grimnoir are to be believed, the evil forces of magic introduced into the world have reached a peak, and the finale for humankind may be about to begin. Here is Bronson Pinchot with part 20 of the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Hard Magic.
Western Colorado. So you're a secret organization that protects actives. Sullivan took a long drag from the second cigarette he'd bombed off of Garrett. The train was rolling into the sunset, and the dining car only had a few other people in it, including a young couple, a businessman, an old woman, and the bored waiter loafing at the far side of the cabin. Nobody was close enough to listen in. And fights evil magic. Basically, yes. Define evil. It's pretty self-explanatory, Garrett exclaimed. Dan, one man's evil is another man's politics. Sullivan had once gone to prison for doing what he knew to be the right thing, and that wasn't too long after fighting in a war where both sides thought of themselves as the good guys. But that didn't stop them from slaughtering each other by the thousands with every tool at hand. I can't define evil, but I sure as hell know when I see it, Heinrich said. Sullivan grunted in affirmation. I thought you said Dan was the one that was good with words. We do whatever it takes to stop those who would use magic to enslave others. On the other hand, we also fight those who would punish all magicals for the actions of a few. There are powerful actives who would like to put the entire world under their boot. They see themselves as the logical end of the eugenicists' argument, the answer to Darwin's theory. On the other side are the normals who are so scared of magic that they would love nothing more than to just stamp us out of existence. Sullivan had smoked the fag down to nothing and stubbed it out in the ashtray. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So if it's so good, why is it secret? Those of us that join the society must fight in the shadows. There are forces at work, whole nations, and things even bigger than nations that would have us fail. They'd hunt us down, and if they couldn't destroy us, they'd kill everyone we love. Sullivan pondered Dan's last few words. He seemed to be telling the truth, or at least he believed he was. Does the U.S. government know about you? Parts of it, Garrett said hesitantly, glancing around the room. It's complicated. I'm an American first, active second, Sullivan growled. Despite it being run by a bunch of idiots, Sullivan loved his country, and his loyalty ran deep. His older brother, Matt, had often made fun of him for it, but Sullivan was at heart a patriotic man. There are grimoires in every country. We'd never ask any of them to do anything that goes against conscience. Listen, I can't tell you too much. I've been asked to make you an offer. Your talents would be invaluable, but if you turn us down, the less you know, the better off you are. You join us, and then I can answer all your questions. What's in it for me? Sullivan asked, expecting the usual answers for when someone was trying to hire out some muscle. Cash, booze, dames. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward, looking him square in the eye. You get to learn more about magic than you ever thought possible, and you get to make a difference. That wasn't the answer he was expecting. That answer felt good, but it also made him suspicious. He checked his head again, but unless Garrett was the best mouth ever, he could sense no intrusion. But life had bit him too many times to not be apprehensive. Who runs the show? What? Heinrich gave a sardonic laugh. So maybe when you take that bit of intelligence back to J. Edgar Hoover, all will be forgiven? That was a sore spot. Screw you, Fade. So, you're ashamed that you hunted down your own kind, aren't you? Sullivan raised his voice slightly. I agreed to help the BI, but I only went after murderers. That was the deal. Like Delilah Jones, Heinrich spat. It was being lied to about Delilah that had sent Sullivan down this path to begin with. They told me she was a cold-blooded killer. I bought it. How is she? Alive. Which is more than I could say than if you'd succeeded. All she had done was defend herself from the men who had already shot her father to bits. Good work there. If we had not come to save her, she'd be dead by now, picked out of the jail cell you put her in for the convenience of the Imperium. Heinrich's face was getting red. And you question our honor? Our judgment? I think not. Heavy. Something he'd said had set the young German off. Maybe Sullivan had finally met somebody as distrusting as he was. Easy, Heinrich, Garrett cautioned. I can't answer that yet, Jake. You must understand. Damn it, he was tired of being lied to, sick of being kept in the dark by everyone around him. His patience was done. Sullivan lurched out of the booth, hands on the table to hold himself steady. His body ached beyond comprehension, and he was in a foul mood. I'm not taking a job if I can't even know who I'm working for, so I'll just be getting off at the next town. Thanks for the dinner and the duds, but I consider them payback for the ones I wrecked falling off that blimp. Garrett shook his head sadly. Sorry to hear that, pal. I'd say that this was a wasted trip, but we did kill an iron guard. Don't get to do that every day. What are you going to do about the BI? We'll work something out, Sullivan muttered, dreading the thought of Rockville. He'd need to come up with a story that would satisfy Hoover as to why he'd gone to visit Torrio and then managed to destroy an entire hotel. Easy as pie. So long, boys. Thanks for helping me ice that Jap. And tell Delilah I'm real sorry.
So long, Heavy, Heinrich said. I knew this was a mistake from the...
He froze. Looking down at his fingers, Garrett suddenly flinched and curled his hand into a fist. Sullivan paused, noticing that both men were looking at their rings. Heinrich suddenly rose and swept all of the dishes and cups onto the floor, spilling coffee across the linoleum. The other patrons startled, and the old lady glared at them disapprovingly. Daniel jumped into the aisle and shouted, "Attention, passengers, everyone needs to go back to their cabins right now. This is not a big deal, and you will remember being asked to move by the conductor." The other passengers got up and headed vacantly for the exits. Sullivan felt the words slamming around inside his skull. Garrett's power was staggering, and he felt a strong urge to walk right out, but he focused on a spot on the wall until the feeling subsided. "Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant evening." Garrett made eye contact with Sullivan as he passed, as if surprised to see him sticking around. "Hey, waiter, lock the doors and get out. You need a 10-minute smoke break."
"Right away, sir,"
the waiter complied without question. There had been no finesse there, just the power of suggestion wielded like a club. Garrett may have looked like a balding, nebbishy librarian, but he was one of the strongest actives Sullivan had yet encountered. Heinrich grabbed the salt shaker, unscrewed the lid, and poured it onto their hastily cleared table. He stuck a finger into the pile and stirred until he'd made a circle 4 inches across.
"Don't just stand there, Heavy. Fetch me a glass of water."
Curious, Sullivan complied, picked up a cup from the next table, and handed it over. Heinrich stuck 2 fingers in the water and swirled it about, then took them out and drew 2 symbols in the center of the circle of salt. Garrett returned from checking the doors a moment later. "You better get out of here. We just got the kind of signal that means one of those things that you don't want to know about is going down."
"Well, now I'm curious."
Heinrich said a few words under his breath as he stared into the circle. At first Sullivan thought it was German, but it was something different and unfamiliar. There was a drumming noise, at first indistinguishable from the wheels on the track, but it grew in pitch until it was just a ringing in the ears. The room seemed to flex, almost like when Sullivan was testing his own power, and then a white glow appeared as the salt seemed to ignite. It burned brightly, as if it were being fused into a solid object. It floated up from the table and rotated until it was facing them at eye level. It was like looking at a tiny motion picture, like one of those new television devices. There were people moving in the circle, but they were slightly hazy, and he could see the train's window through them.
"Daniel, Heinrich, this is Lance. Can you hear me?"
A face appeared in the floating circle, a blunt-nosed man with a lumberjack's beard.
"Got you, Lance,"
Garrett replied. Injuries forgotten, Sullivan moved around to the side. No matter where he stood, the porthole seemed to turn to face him so he could see the same picture. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't a power that resided inside someone. This was magic on its own, like something from an old fairy tale. Heinrich had just cast an actual spell, which, according to everything he'd ever read, was totally impossible.
"Do you remember the stories about the G-Hotel?" the man in the circle asked.
"Of course," Daniel replied. "Oh, no. Did he find part of it?"
"It looks like he got part of the Portuguese and probably the blueprints from Jones."
The mouth swore under his breath. "This is bad, very bad. Will he be able to build one?"
"The G-Hotel, what's that?"
Heinrich asked.
"No time to explain," Lance said. "We don't know if the chairman's got enough to figure one out yet or not. Where are you?"
"We're on the Pullman, Denver to Ogden. We're almost in Utah now," Garrett responded.
"You're the closest to Christensen. Make sure he's all right. Hold on, the general needs to speak with you."
The view of the circle shifted, careening wildly about, and Sullivan saw several other people, including an old, bald man who looked
strangely familiar, and a young girl in a rough dress. Then the view seemed to lift and settle downward so that it was looking into the face of a man lying flat on his back in bed. The man had to be over 100 years old. His face was like a skull, crossed with purple veins, milky cataract-filled eyes with gray skin stretched tight over it, mottled with blotches and bruises. Tubes had been run into his nostrils. "Garrett." His voice was almost a whisper, and Sullivan was impressed that he could do that much. "Get to Sven as quickly as you can. Recover the device that was in his protection." "Yes, General." Apparently those eyes could still see. "Is this the heavy?" He stepped forward. "I'm Jake Sullivan. Who are you?" "We've met before, Sergeant Sullivan. Turns out I pinned a citation star on you myself after the armistice. It was too bad you served under General Roosevelt, because from your reputation I certainly could have used a man like you." Sullivan scowled, studying the diseased face. It couldn't be. The man who had done that honor had been a strong man, and it hadn't been that long ago. "General Pershing? In the flesh, or what's left of it." Sullivan was speechless. John J. Pershing, Supreme Commander of the American Expeditionary Force in the Great War, had disappeared from public life 3 years before. This was the greatest military commander alive, the highest-ranking general in U.S. history, and they'd even talked about running him for president a little while back. "Sir, what happened?" "I've been assassinated. I just haven't given the bastards the satisfaction of dying just yet. Welcome to the Grim Noir, Sullivan." "I haven't exactly enlisted yet." "Then consider yourself drafted, son. All hell's about to break loose." Sullivan hesitated, unsure what to say. "Sir, I don't—" "I'm asking you, one soldier to another, for your help. This is not a small thing, I ask. And it will be dangerous. And it will be a sacrifice. But it is the right thing to do. It is the right thing for your country and your people and your God. And for all that you hold sacred, you have my word." "It ain't like you've got anything better going on." "I'll need to get J. Edgar Hoover off my back. I won't be much good to you as a fugitive." "Important men owe me favors. It's done. Garrett, bring this man up to speed. Go get Christensen. Protect that device at all costs. Burn any Imperium that get in your way. Burn them down. Then get back here. Any questions?" Heinrich and Daniel simultaneously said, "No, sir." Sullivan had 1,000 questions, but he just nodded. "Do not fail." The picture disappeared, leaving a circle of fused salt hanging in the air. The glow dissipated. The circle fell to the table and shattered into bits. "I suppose that answers my question about who calls the shots," Sullivan said.
That was part 20 of the complete audiobook serialization of Hard Magic by Larry Correia, read by Bronson Pinchot. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com. Thanks to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Anagalactic fanfare and full Accord membership as a fully recognized sapient species all on his own, preceding the rest of humanity's admittance, if we ever get admitted, to Charles E. Gannon, author of Trial by Fire. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.